Okay, today we're going to talk about fractions. So when we have fractions, and we're going to talk about addition, subtraction, and multiplication and division. When you have fractions, we got to do a couple things different than we do with other cases. So firstly, what we cannot do, I'm going to put this in red so that we know this is not correct. Okay, this is not correct. What we do not do is simply just add the tops and the bottoms. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 4 is 6, 1/2 plus 1/4 is not 2/6. Okay? I see it all the time. That is not what goes on. Okay? You're forgetting that this is from multiplication. It's very similar in multiplication, but in addition and subtraction, you cannot do this. In order to add up fractions, you must have what's called a common denominator. Okay? So we look at these bottoms. And in order to find a common denominator, we have to use what's called a least common multiple, or also known as an LCM. Okay, so the first thing is we find common multiples. So we list all the multiples of 2. So we start with 2 and we count by 2. So you get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. And then we start with 4. We get 4, 8, 12, 16, etc. And then we look for anything in common. So what's in common? Well, 4 is in common. 8's in common. And if we kept going, 12 and 16 would have also had stuff in commons. So what's the thing about a least common multiple? Well, that's the smallest number that they have in common. In this case, it is 4. It's the smallest number they have in common. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change these denominators to 4. Okay? Because that's what our least common multiple is. Okay, and then what we do is we have to multiply by the top and the bottom by the same number. So I have a 2. I need the answer to be a 4. How do you get from 2 to 4? Well, you multiply by 2. So we're going to multiply this by 2. And if you do it to the bottom, we always do the same thing to top and bottom. So we now have on the bottom 2 times 2, which is 4. On the top, we have 1 times 2, which is 2. So the fraction 2 over 4 is the same as the fraction 1/2. Now we're going to do the same thing here. We go from 4 to 4, and you multiply it by 1. And if you multiply the bottom by 1, you multiply the top by 1. And the nice thing about when you multiply by 1 is it doesn't change your fraction, so this is still the fraction 1/4. Now you are allowed to add. You add by simply adding numerators up. So 2 plus 1 is 3. But here is the big thing. The denominator stays the same. It does not change. That's why you must first have that common denominator, because the denominator does not change. You can only add or subtract when you have a common denominator. So the rules that you have for signed integers still apply. So if the signs are the same, you're going to be adding them up. So 1/2 plus 1/4. If you had made these both negatives, say you had negative 1/2 and negative 1/4, you're still going to add them up, but because they're negatives, the answer would have now been negative 3/4. And let's look at a case when we have 1 positive, 1 negative, because you could have that. So let's go with 1/2 minus 1/4. Okay, you're still going to find the common denominator. So just like we just did a minute ago, you're going to have 2/4 and 1/4. We always subtract big minus small, so we're going to go with 2 minus 1 is 1. So our answer is going to be either positive or negative 1/4. And lastly, we look at the signs. We got 1 and 2. 2 is bigger. The sign on 2 is positive, so the answer is positive 1/4. So that's for multiplication and addition and subtraction. Let's look at multiplication and division. I'm going to make us some space over here. So for multiplication, what we do is this, and these are the easy ones. You simply multiply across. You go 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 4 is 8, and then you're done. What you have to watch out for, and this applies for addition as well, it just doesn't show up as often, is can this be reduced? So let's do one that's going to create something that's going to give us a problem. Let's say that we have 3/4 and 2/3, and we're going to multiply this, and you end up with getting 6 over 12. Okay, so you did 3 times 2 is 6, you did 4 times 3 is 12, and we're happy, except this is not reduced. This is not an acceptable answer. Only reduced answers are acceptable in high school math, so please make sure you're reducing your answers, otherwise they are marked wrong. So how do we reduce something? Well, the fancy way of doing it is this. You look for what's called a greatest common factor, or a GCF. This is something you studied in elementary school. And what we're going to first do is list the factors of 6. So a factor is any number when you multiply it by another number, you get the answer. In this case, we're looking for an answer of 6. So what numbers multiply to 6? Well, you get 1 times 6 is 6, and you get 2 times 3 is 6. So our factors of 6 are 1, 2, 3, and 6. And we'll do the same thing with 12. You get 1 times 12. We have 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12 are all factors of 12. And just like before, we're looking for common factors. So let's look for everything in common. 1 is in common in both of these lists. 2 is in common in both of these lists, as is 3, and as is 6. Okay. Quick note here on the 1. The 1 is always in common. So if you have no common factors except for 1, that's how you know something is fully reduced. If there is any other common factors besides 1, then it can still be reduced. But 1 will always be in common because everything is divisible by 1. So as the name suggests, greatest common factor is the greatest number in common. In this case, that greatest number is 6. So we're going to divide top and bottom by our greatest common factor, which in this case is 6. 6 divided by 6 is the number 1. 12 divided by 6 is the number 2. So 6 over 12 is reduced to 1/2. 1/2 is the correct answer. Sometimes you end up with improper fractions, such as, well, let's just flip this one upside down. 12 over 6. You can leave things as improper fractions, but they also have to be reduced. So when you reduce this, you're going to end up getting 2 over 1, because you can divide top and bottom by 6. But 2 over 1 is a special case. This is simply the number 2. So if you have anything which is divisible by 1, just write it as its integer form, which is a number 2. But you might end up with something else like 12 over 7. That can't be reduced. You can leave it in its improper form. You do not need to change it to a mixed number. You may. It's not wrong to have a mixed number, but you can leave it as an improper fraction, and oftentimes in algebra, that's more helpful to us than changing it to a mixed number. So often what ends up happening is you'll change it to a mixed number, and then you have to change it back to that improper fraction so we can use it further. Lastly, division. I'm going to get myself a little bit more space here. For division, you're going to do what's called keep, change, flip. Okay, so we're going to do keep, change, flip. And when you do that, you're going to take your division problem and make it into a multiplication problem. So you have, say, 1/2 divided by 1/4. Okay, keep means the first fraction, we keep it exactly as you see it. So 1/2 will stay 1/2. The change means that I'm going to take the division symbol and I'm going to change it to a multiply problem. So that's our change, division to multiplication. And flip means that we're going to take the second fraction and we're going to flip it upside down. In math, we call that taking the reciprocal. Okay, so we're going to flip it upside down, also known as the reciprocal. And now I have a multiply problem. So just like we did before, we multiply straight across. So I have 1 times 4 is 4. And 2 times 1 is 2. And this can be reduced. There's a 2 in common, so we'll divide the 2 off. And anytime it's over 1, that's simply the number 2. But here's what I want to show you. If we go back and look over here, there is a couple things in common. So when we multiply across, and this is a multiply only issue, does not work for addition, subtraction, or division. This is multiply only. If the same number is on top and bottom, we can cancel it off. So firstly, I see a number 1 here and a number 1 here. So we don't need either one of those, so we're going to cross those off. They're gone. As long as the same number's on top and bottom, we can cross them off. As a matter of fact, I'm seeing a 2 here, and I think I can make this 4 into a 2. So instead of writing 4, I'm going to rewrite that as 2 times 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. And now we have a 2 in common, so we can cross the 2's off. That 2 and that 2. And what's left is the 2, which is what the answer is. And this always works. So you can get some really weird things, like say that you have 1 over 37 times 37 over 4. And you can cross the 37's out, and the answer is simply 1/4. Otherwise, you have to multiply, and then you'll have to reduce, and you'll end up having 37 over 4 times 37, and then divide both by 37, and you still end up with 1 over 4. So this is a neat little trick, but either method is fine. You can always just multiply across if you don't see any way to reduce it, but make sure that if you're crossing off, it has to be 1 on top and 1 on bottom. Side to side does not work, and this does not work unless it's multiply. Does not work for addition, subtraction, nor division. Only for multiplication. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask.